The scent of expensive lilies was so thick it felt like a physical weight, a floral shroud draped over the grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel. To any outsider, it was the wedding of the century. Kang Dae stood at the altar, a monolith in a bespoke Italian tuxedo, his face a mask of chiseled granite. He was the Iron King of the Guillaume Syndicate, a man rumored to have dismantled a rival gang using nothing but a heavy-duty stapler and a cold stare. Beside him, Hee-sun was a masterpiece of lace and silk, her smile radiating a warmth that didn't quite reach her watchful, calculating eyes. The air in the room didn't circulate, it vibrated. Half the guests were politicians with forced smiles, and the other half were men with thick necks and concealed holsters who looked like they were attending a funeral they had personally arranged. As the officiant droned on about the sacred bond of blood and legacy, Kang Dae's jaw tightened. Every time the word legacy or progeny was uttered, a phantom itch started at the back of his skull. He stole a glance at his father-in-law, the aging chairman, who sat in the front row like a silver-haired vulture. The old man didn't want a son-in-law. He wanted a stallion to secure the lineage. The tension followed Kang Dae even when he managed to slip away during the reception. He needed a moment of silence, a reprieve from the suffocating performance of the alpha. He retreated into the marble and gold sanctuary of the executive men's room, leaning his weight against the sink. He stared at his reflection, loathing the crown he was forced to wear. The heavy door creaked open. Two men entered, their footsteps echoing with the heavy rhythm of soldiers. Kang Dae instinctively retreated into the shadows of a mahogany stall, his hand drifting toward the small of his back, where a blade usually rested. "Did you see the way the chairman was looking at him?" One of the men chuckled, the sound wet and mocking. Kang Dae recognized the voice. It was Park, a mid-level captain with an oversized ego. "Like he's looking at a golden goose. Poor old man thinks he's getting a grandson." "He's getting a eunuch in a fancy suit," the second man spat, the sound of a lighter flicking open punctuating his words. "My cousin works at the Seoul National Urology Clinic. He saw the files before they were misplaced by the syndicate's cleaners." The great Kang Dae, the man who killed a dozen Russians in a basement, can't even get his own engine to start. The air in the stall turned frigid. Kang Dae frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, the only part of him that felt truly alive and terrified. "Impotent," Park whispered, the word landing like a gunshot. "A dead branch on the family tree. The girl is just a decorative shield. Once the chairman finds out his heir is shooting blanks, Kang Dae won't be the boss. He'll be fish bait." They laughed, a crude, guttural sound that echoed off the expensive tiles. They spoke of his failure as if it were a tactical weakness, a chink in the armor that made him prey. In their world, a man who couldn't conquer his own body had no right to conquer the city. The men finished their business and exited, their laughter lingering in the air like a foul odor. Kang Dae stepped out of the stall, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the marble vanity. He didn't look at his reflection this time. He looked at his hands, the hands that could break a man's neck in seconds, yet were powerless to fix the one thing that mattered in this den of wolves. He straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his tuxedo, and wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. The wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a countdown. He walked back out into the roar of the ballroom toward his beautiful, fake bride, knowing that every eye in the room was now a sniper's scope aimed at his groin. The marriage of lies had begun, and the first casualty was his pride. The penthouse was a glass cage perched 60 stories above the neon arteries of Seoul, a masterpiece of cold minimalism and reinforced steel. Outside, the city hummed with the oblivious energy of millions. Inside, the silence was so sharp it could have drawn blood. Kang Dae stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tuxedo jacket discarded on a leather sofa that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He watched the reflection of Hee-sun as she moved through the room, shedding her pearl necklace and the heavy silk of her wedding veil with the efficiency of a soldier stripping a rifle. She didn't look like a trembling bride. She looked like a woman who had just survived a heist and was ready to split the loot. They know, Kangdae said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the fine crystal on the sideboard. He didn't turn around. Or at least, the whispers have started. Park and his crew, they've heard rumors from the clinic. Hee-sun paused, her fingers lingering on the zipper of her gown. She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She simply stepped out of the mountain of lace, standing in a simple slip that looked like armor in the dim light. Rumors are just noise until there's proof, and we are going to make sure the proof is whatever we decide it is. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the polished hardwood. She stopped 3 feet away, the boundary of their professional arrangement. You need a legacy to satisfy the chairman and keep the vultures from tearing you apart. I need the protection of your name and the capital to liquidate my father's debts before the loan sharks decide my organs are worth more than my smile. This isn't a romance, Kangdae. It's a merger. Kangdae finally turned, his dark eyes searching hers. He was a man built for violence, his shoulders broad and his hands scarred, yet he felt strangely diminished under her steady gaze. The chairman expects a grandchild within the year. He's already talking about the naming ceremony. How do you propose we manufacture a miracle when the doctors say the well is dry? We don't need a miracle, we need a script, she replied, reaching for a sleek leather portfolio she had hidden in her vanity. She laid it on the coffee table. It was the contract. The real one. Rule number 1. Public displays of affection are mandatory. You will look at me with the hunger of a man obsessed. You will hold my waist in front of the cameras as if you're afraid someone will steal me. If the world thinks you can't keep your hands off me, they'll stop wondering why the nursery is empty. Kangdae looked at the document. It was cold, clinical, and perfect. And in private? In private, we are business partners, Hee-sun said, her voice softening just a fraction, though her eyes remained steel. We sleep in separate wings. No one enters this penthouse without a 48-hour notice. If a doctor is needed, it will be my doctor, someone I've already bought and paid for. We fake the morning sickness. We fake the sonograms. We buy ourselves 12 months to consolidate your power. Once you're chairman, you can lose the child or find a surrogate in the shadows. By then, you'll be too powerful for anyone to question your virility. Kangdae felt a bitter laugh catch in his throat. He was one of the most feared men in the country, yet he was signing a treaty to hide the fact that he was broken. He picked up a fountain pen, its gold nib glinting. And if I fail? And if the Viper sees through this? Hee-sun stepped closer, crossing the 3-foot line. She reached out, not to touch his face, but to straighten the collar of his shirt with a chillingly domestic precision. Then we both end up at the bottom of the Han River. So, for the sake of our lives, try to look a little more in love, Kangdae. It's the only weapon you have left that actually works. He signed the paper. The ink was black, permanent, and bound them together more tightly than any vow they had spoken at the altar. They were now the architects of a grand delusion, 2 ghosts living in a bulletproof palace, waiting for the world to find out that the king had no crown. The restaurant was a subterranean fortress of black marble and hushed whispers, tucked beneath a Michelin-starred facade in Gangnam. It was the kind of place where the wine cost more than a high-end sedan, and the menus didn't feature prices, because the men eating there paid in favors and blood. At the center of the room sat the Viper, a man whose real name had been forgotten in favor of a title earned by his habit of striking from the tall grass. He watched Kangdae and Hee-sun enter, his eyes glittering like shards of obsidian. Kangdae felt the weight of the room the moment he stepped inside. It wasn't just the presence of 20 armed bodyguards leaning against the walls, it was the predatory stillness. He felt Hee-sun's hand slide into the crook of his arm. Her touch was light, but her grip had a calculated intensity, a silent reminder to stay in character. The happy couple, the Viper purred, his voice like sandpaper on silk. He didn't rise. In a calculated insult that Kang Dae had to swallow like a bitter pill. Marriage seems to have softened you, Kang Dae. You used to smell of gunpowder. Now you smell of Chanel? It's a gift from my wife, Kang Dae replied, pulling out Hee-sun's chair with a flourish that felt foreign to his stiff limbs. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, a proximity that made his pulse thrum with a different kind of anxiety. She has excellent taste, something you wouldn't understand, sitting in the dark for so long. The table was set with exquisite delicacy, but the food felt like ash in Kang Dae's mouth. Throughout the meal, the Viper circled their relationship with the precision of a prosecutor. He asked about their honeymoon, their private habits, and the future of the lineage. His questions laced with a poisonous curiosity. He was looking for the stutter in the rhythm, the infinitesimal gap between the lie and the truth. I heard a curious thing, Kang Dae, the Viper said, swirling a glass of deep red Bordeaux. A rumor from a certain clinic. A story about a lion who can't roar. They say your house is grand, but the hearth is cold. The air in the room vanished. One of Kang Dae's men shifted his hand toward his jacket, but Kang Dae raised a hand, stopping him. He felt a cold sweat prickling his spine. This was the moment. The Iron King was being challenged in the only way he couldn't fight back with his fists. Hee-sun didn't miss a beat. She laughed, a low, melodic sound that cut through the tension like a diamond through glass. She reached across the table, covering Kang Dae's hand with hers, her thumb tracing the scars on his knuckles with a slow, hypnotic intimacy. Men and their gossip, she said, looking directly into the Viper's eyes with a chillingly beautiful smirk. If my husband spent as much time roaring in public as he does in our bedroom, he wouldn't have the energy to run this city. Perhaps the reason you hear so many rumors, Viper, is because you spend too much time listening at keyholes and not enough time being a man yourself. She leaned closer to Kang Dae, her eyes softening into a look of such convincing adoration that even he almost believed it. Tell him, darling. Or better yet, don't. Some things are too precious to share with the help. The Viper's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. He was looking for a flush of shame on Kang Dae's face, a tremor in Hee-sun's hand. He found neither. Kang Dae took the cue, lifting Hee-sun's hand to his lips and kissing her palm, his eyes locked on his rival. It was an act of defiance, a performance of virility that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with theater. The hearth is plenty warm, Kang Dae said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Try to touch it, and you'll find out how quickly you burn. The dinner ended in a stalemate, but as they walked back to the armored SUV, the silence between them was different. The performance had worked, but the shadow of the lie had grown longer. As the door closed, Hee-sun pulled her hand away, the warmth vanishing instantly. He's not convinced, she whispered, staring at the neon lights blurring past the window. He's just waiting for us to blink. The clinic was hidden behind the rusted facade of a dry cleaning business in a crumbling corner of Yeongdongpo. It wasn't the kind of place a man of Kang Dae's stature usually frequented, but desperation had a way of stripping away the need for luxury. Inside, the air smelled of industrial detergent and ozone. The doctor, a man named Dr. Han who had lost his license for performing discreet surgeries on syndicate soldiers, looked at Kang Dae's charts with a grimace that made the mobster's stomach churn. Hee-sun stood by the door, her hand resting inside her designer handbag where a compact 9mm lay nestled against her lipstick. She was the one who had vetted Han, but in this world, loyalty was a commodity with a volatile exchange rate. The biological indicators haven't shifted, Han muttered, peering over his spectacles. He didn't dare look Kang Dae in the eye. Stress is a catalyst, and your life is a pressure cooker. There are experimental treatments, hormone suppressors, and nerve stimulants, but they come with side effects, aggression, tremors, heart palpitations. I don't care about the cost, Kang Dai growled, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. He felt exposed, stripped of his suit and his status, reduced to a set of malfunctioning variables on a screen. I need results. If the chairman suspects, the chairman is the least of your worries. Hee-sun interrupted, her voice sharp as a razor. She had moved to the window, peeling back a corner of a yellowed blind. We have company. Kang Dae was across the room in a second, his lethargy vanishing as the predator took over. Outside, 3 black sedans had pulled up, deboxing in their nondescript SUV. Men were spilling out, not with the practiced discipline of his own guards, but with the frantic energy of the Viper's street-level scavengers. They weren't there to talk. They were there to verify a rumor and bury the evidence. Han, get in the back, Kang Dae commanded, drawing his weapon. The doctor didn't need to be told twice. The first bullet shattered the front window of the dry cleaners, sending a spray of glass across the linoleum like diamonds in the dirt. Kang Dae pushed Hee-sun down behind a heavy industrial washing machine. The roar of the gunfire was deafening in the cramped space, a jagged contrast to the hushed secrets they had just been discussing. I thought this place was secure, Kang Dae shouted over the rhythmic crack-crack of his own return fire. It was, Hee-sun retorted. She didn't just stay down. She leaned around the edge of the machine, her 9mm barking with a steady, terrifying precision. She clipped a man coming through the door, sending him spiraling back into the street. Either Han talked, or someone followed us from the penthouse. We're compromised. The hit squad was aggressive, moving in with the knowledge that they had the Iron King trapped in a cage of his own making. A grenade thudded against the floor, rolling toward the back office. Kang Dae lunged, grabbing the doctor by the collar and throwing him toward the rear exit just as the explosion ripped through the storefront. The blast threw Kang Dae against the wall, his ears ringing, his vision blurring into a haze of gray smoke and red heat. Through the fog, he saw a silhouette approaching. One of the Viper's men, one a jagged scar across his face, raised a shotgun. Kang Dae's hand fumbled for his gun, but his fingers felt like lead. The impotence he felt wasn't just physical anymore. It was a total system failure. Then, a flash of white lace and black steel. Hee-sun didn't hesitate. She stepped into the line of fire, her body a shield, her weapon steady. She emptied the magazine into the gunman's chest before he could pull the trigger. She turned back to Kang Dae, her face smudged with soot, her eyes burning with a fierce protective rage. She grabbed him by his lapels, hauling him toward the back alley where the secondary getaway car was stashed. Don't you dare give up, she hissed, her breath hot against his ear. You're the boss of this city. I now start acting like it before I have to kill you myself. As they tore away into the rain-slicked night, the clinic in flames behind them, Kang Dae realized with a jolt of terror that the marriage of lies was no longer just about power. It was about survival. And for the first time in his life, the person holding the gun wasn't the only one in control. The safe house was a claustrophobic apartment in a concrete block that smelled of damp wood and old cooking oil, a far cry from the sanitized luxury of their penthouse. Outside, the rain lashed against the single window, blurring the world into a smudge of gray. Kang Dae sat on a sagging bed, his shirt discarded. The explosion at the clinic had left a jagged bloom of purple and red across his ribs, but it was the tremor in his hands that he couldn't hide. He looked less like a king and more like a broken engine, stalled in the dark. Hee-sun approached with a first aid kit, her movements devoid of the bridal grace she wore like a costume. She sat beside him, the mattress dipping under her weight. As she pressed a cold antiseptic swab to his side, he flinched, a low hiss escaping his teeth. Hold still, she murmured. The man who took 3 bullets in Incheon shouldn't be jumping at a little alcohol. That was different, Kang Dae grumbled, his voice thick. In Incheon, I knew where the enemy was. Now I feel like the enemy is inside my own skin. He went silent as she worked, her fingers surprisingly gentle. She reached around to check a bruise on his shoulder and paused. Her touch lingered on a cluster of old, silvery scars, not the clean lines of knife wounds or the puckered holes of gunshots, but jagged, irregular marks that looked like they had been burned into him long ago. They were centered around his spine, a map of ancient pain. "These didn't come from a gang war?" He-sun said softly, her voice losing its transactional edge. Kang Dae stiffened, his instinct to strike back warring with a sudden crushing exhaustion. He looked away, staring at the peeling wallpaper. "My father didn't believe in soft airs. He thought a leader had to be forged in fire. Literally. He used to say that if I couldn't stand the heat of a cigarette or a branding iron, I'd never survive the heat of the syndicate." He let out a short, hollow laugh. He wanted to make me invincible. Instead, he just broke something deep inside. "The doctors, they say the trauma is somatic. My mind remembers the pain every time I try to feel something else. My body thinks intimacy is just another trap, another way to get burned." The silence that followed wasn't the cold, tactical quiet of their contract. It was heavy with the weight of a secret he had never breathed aloud. The Iron King was a shell, a suit of armor built over a terrified boy who had learned to associate touch with agony. His impotence wasn't a biological failure, it was a psychological fortress. He-sun didn't pull away. She didn't offer pity, which he would have hated. Instead, she rested her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his racing heart. For the first time, her touch didn't feel like a move in a chess game. "My father didn't use fire," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "He used debt. He used me as collateral from the time I could walk. I learned to be a masterpiece because if I wasn't perfect, I was worthless. We're both just products of men who didn't know how to love anything they couldn't own." Kang Dae looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the cracks in her own porcelain mask. The marriage of lies had been built on the idea that they were two predators teaming up. Now, in the dim light of a failing safe house, they were just two survivors hiding in the wreckage of their upbringings. He didn't move to embrace her. He wasn't there yet. But he didn't pull away when her thumb traced a slow, rhythmic circle over his heart. The Mafia boss persona was slipping, melting away like wax in the heat of a raw, uncomfortable honesty. "If the Viper finds out about this," Kang Dae whispered, "he won't just kill me. He'll mock me until I'm a ghost." "Then we won't let him find out," He-sun replied, her voice regaining its steel but tempered now with a genuine alliance. "We'll play the part. But tonight, you don't have to be the king. You just have to be the man who survived." The lie was a masterstroke of desperation, a gilded cage they built for themselves, with a single press release and a strategically timed fainting spell during the chairman's birthday gala. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the Gyumpa syndicate was buzzing with the news. The Iron King had secured his succession. The announcement acted like a temporary ceasefire. The Viper's public provocations ceased, replaced by a suffocating, watchful silence. But as the external pressure eased, and the internal weight of the deception began to crush the oxygen out of their bulletproof penthouse, He-sun became the architect of the illusion. She curated the props with a terrifying attention to detail. Prenatal vitamins scattered on the marble countertops, designer maternity wear that draped over her still flat stomach, and a digital folder of sonograms purchased from a black market broker in Busan. She even learned how to mimic the pale, drawn look of morning sickness, spending hours in the bathroom with the door cracked just enough for the household staff to hear the sounds of a struggling mother-to-be. "The staff report everything to your father-in-law," she whispered one evening, leaning over the toilet to maintain the charade while Kang Dae stood guard. "If they don't see me pale by 8 a.m., the rumor mill starts turning again." Kang Dae watched her, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He was a man who had built his life on the brutal honesty of a blade, yet he was now presiding over a kingdom of smoke. He found himself playing the part of the doting father with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. He banned smoking in the penthouse. He ordered crates of organic fruit from Jeju Island. He played the role so well that sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he would catch himself looking at Hee-sun's stomach with a flicker of genuine hope, only to be slapped back to reality by the cold, flat silk of her nightgown. The pressure reached a breaking point during a mandatory family dinner at the chairman's estate. The old man was radiant, his usual predatory gaze softened by the prospect of a grandson. And he presented them with a hand-carved jade tiger, a traditional talisman for a strong male heir. To the future of the Gyumpa, the chairman toasted, his eyes fixed on Kangdae with a terrifying warmth. I've already scouted the private tutors. He will be raised to be even harder than his father. Hee-sun smiled, the perfect image of a blooming bride, but Kangdae felt her hand trembling beneath the table. He reached out and gripped it, his thumb rubbing the back of her palm in the rhythmic circle she had used on him in the safe house. It was supposed to be a performance for the chairman, but as their eyes met, the lie felt like it was swallowing them whole. They weren't just deceiving the mob, they were grieving a child that didn't exist, trapped in a mourning period for a future they could never have. Back in the car, the silence was jagged. The back seat of the armored sedan felt like a confessional. We can't keep this up for 9 months, Hee-sun, Kangdae said, his voice raw. The belly has to grow. The doctors will want to visit. The chairman wants to feel the kick. We are building a mountain out of sand. We don't need 9 months, she snapped, though her eyes were wet. We just need enough time for you to take the vote of confidence in October. After that, we lose the baby. A tragic accident. A miscarriage brought on by the stress of a rival's threat. It happens all the time in our world. She turned to look out the window at the blurred city lights, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. It's just one more lie, Kangdae. What's one more ghost in a house full of them? Kangdae looked at his hands. The hands of a man who was supposed to be a king, but felt like a fraud. The lie had grown a life of its own, a phantom child that sat between them, demanding a devotion they couldn't give and a future they couldn't provide. He realized then that the marriage of lies wasn't just a shield. It was a slow-acting poison, and they were both drinking deep from the cup. The loyalty of a right-hand man is not built on love. It is built on the shared belief that the leader is a god. For Jin-ho, who had stood at Kangdae's shoulder through a decade of street wars and boardroom assassinations, that belief began to erode the moment he found the waste. He wasn't looking for a betrayal, he was looking for a signature on a smuggling manifest when he entered the penthouse office and found the trash hadn't been emptied. There, nestled atop a pile of shredded documents, was a discarded silicone prosthetic, a bump designed to mimic the second trimester. Beside it lay a receipt for a digital rendering service specializing in faked ultrasound imagery. Jin-ho didn't feel anger at first. He felt the cold, creeping terror of a man who realizes he has been kneeling at an empty altar. He had killed for Kangdae. He had bled for a legacy that was, in reality, a desert. To a soldier like Jin-ho, impotence wasn't a medical tragedy. It was a forfeit of the right to rule. If the king couldn't produce an heir, the kingdom was up for grabs, and Jin-ho wasn't about to go down with a sinking ship built on rubber and lies. The meeting with the Viper took place in the back of a shipping container in the Incheon docks, the air smelling of salt and diesel. The Viper sat on a crate of contraband electronics, looking like a man who had finally caught the scent of blood. When Jin-ho tossed the high-resolution photos of the prosthetic and the clinic receipts onto the table, the silence was broken only by the Viper's slow, rhythmic whistling. "A rubber baby," the Viper whispered, a jagged grin spreading across his face. "The Iron King is hiding behind a doll. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The man who wanted to be a legend is actually just a ghost in a suit. I want the Gangnam territory and a seat at the table when the chairman falls," Jin-ho said, his voice flat, scrubbed of the brotherhood he had once felt for Kangdae. "The chairman has a code. If he finds out his bloodline is being mocked with silicone and Photoshop, he won't just kill Kangdae. He'll erase him." "Consider it done," the Viper replied, his eyes gleaming. But we don't just tell the chairman. We show him. We wait for the naming ceremony feast next week. We'll let Kangdae stand there in front of all the regional bosses, toast to his phantom son, and then we'll pull the rug out. I want to see the moment the light leaves his eyes. Back at the penthouse, oblivious to the knife already hovering over his spine, Kangdae was sitting on the balcony with Hee-sun. For the first time, they weren't talking about the contract. They were sharing a bottle of expensive scotch, watching the moon reflect off the Han River. The air felt lighter, perhaps because they had become so accustomed to the weight of the lie that it felt like a second skin. "Do you ever wonder who we would have been?" Kangdae asked, the alcohol softening the edges of his voice. "If your father wasn't a gambler and mine wasn't a monster?" Hee-sun looked at him, her mask slipping just enough to show the weariness beneath. "We would have been boring, Kangdae. And in this city, boring is a luxury neither of us could ever afford." She reached out and adjusted his cufflink, a gesture that was now habitual. Kangdae didn't flinch. He didn't feel the phantom burn of his father's cigarettes. He felt a strange, quiet tether to the woman beside him, a bond forged in a shared fire. Just then, Jin-ho entered the balcony. He bowed low, his face a perfect mask of the loyalty he had already sold. "Boss, the preparations for the ceremony are complete. Everything is in place." "Good work, Jin-ho," Kangdae said, turning back to the river unsuspecting. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Jin-ho smiled, a thin, sharp line in the dark. "You're about to find out, boss." The betrayal didn't arrive with a shout. It came with the chilling click of a dozen safeties being disengaged simultaneously. The naming ceremony had barely begun when the lights in the chairman's grand hall flickered and died, plunging the assembly of monsters into a suffocating dark. When the emergency red strobes kicked in, the world had shifted. The men who had been bowing to Kangdae seconds ago were now facing him, their weapons leveled not at the doors, but at his heart. At the center of the treachery stood Jin-ho, holding a tablet that projected the black market medical files and the images of the prosthetic bump onto the wide screens above the banquet table. The silence that followed was more violent than any gunshot. The chairman, Kangdae's father-in-law, didn't scream. He simply rose from his seat, his face turning a shade of gray that signaled a death sentence. He looked at Hee-sun's midsection with a disgust so profound it seemed to wither the air. "A lie of the flesh is a lie of the blood," the chairman whispered, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Kill them, both of them." The first volley of gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers, raining glass down like frozen tears. Kangdae didn't think. The years of brutal conditioning took over. He lunged across the table, tackling Hee-sun to the floor, just as a swarm of bullets shredded the upholstery where they had been sitting. He kicked the heavy mahogany table onto its side, creating a temporary barrier against the storm of lead. "Go! To the service entrance!" Kangdae roared, drawing his weapon and firing blindly over the edge of the table to suppress the advance of his own former soldiers. Hee-sun was already moving, her evening gown torn at the hem to allow her to sprint. She grabbed a fallen submachine gun from a dead guard with a fluidity that betrayed her own desperation. Together, they carved a bloody path through the kitchen, the scent of searing meat and gunpowder mixing into a nauseating haze. They burst through the rear exit into the freezing rain of a Busan night, the city's neon signs bleeding into the slick, black asphalt. They didn't have their armored SUV. Jin-ho would have sabotaged it or tracked the GPS. Instead, they hotwired a rusted delivery van parked in a nearby alley. Kangdae slammed the vehicle into gear, the tires screaming as they fishtailed onto the coastal road. Behind them, the headlights of 5 black sedans appeared like the eyes of pursuing wolves. "They won't stop," Hee-sun gasped, clutching a wound on her arm where a glass shard had sliced deep. Her face was white, the rain-drenched lace of her dress clinging to her like a shroud. "The Viper has the chairman's blessing now. We're not just outcasts, Kangdae. We're trophies." The chase led them through the narrow, winding labyrinth of the Gamcheon district, the van scraping against concrete walls as Kangdae pushed the engine to its breaking point. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, turning the steep streets into rivers. Every turn was a gamble. Every shadow was a potential ambush. The syndicate's reach was everywhere in this city. Tien and the Iron King was now a man without a country. Finally, the van's engine gave out with a final choked wheeze near the darkened docks. They abandoned the vehicle, slipping into the maze of shipping containers and rusted cranes. The sound of the sea was a low, rhythmic growl, mocking the silence of their fallen empire. Kangdae led her into the hull of a decommissioned fishing boat, the air thick with the smell of salt and rot. As they sat in the darkness, shivering and bleeding, the distance between them vanished. There was no more contract, no more merger, and no more fake pregnancy. There was only the heat of their bodies pressed together for warmth and the shared knowledge that by dawn they would likely be corpses. "I'm sorry," Kangdae whispered, his hands shaking as he tried to reload his last magazine. "I brought you into a grave." Hee-sun reached out, her fingers cold as ice as she cupped his face, forcing him to look at her through the gloom. "It's the most honest place we've ever been, Kangdae. Stop apologizing. If we're going to die, let's die as the people we are, not the lies they made us." The rain had followed them from Busan to Seoul, a relentless, gray deluge that washed the blood from the fenders of the stolen sedan, but couldn't touch the cold fire burning in Kangdae's chest. He stood before the glass and steel monolith of the Gyumpa headquarters, not as the Iron King returning to his throne, but as a ghost coming to haunt the living. He had shed the tuxedo, the cufflinks, and the pretension of the perfect heir. He wore a simple black tactical jacket, his hair plastered to his forehead, and a pair of eyes that had seen the end of the world and decided they didn't mind the view. Beside him, Hee-sun checked the action on her pistol. She didn't look like a bride anymore. She looked like a widow who hadn't bothered to wait for the funeral. "If we go in there," she said, her voice steady against the roar of the rain, "there is no version of this where we walk out and go back to our old lives." "The old lives were a cage," Kangdae replied. "I'm tired of living in a house of glass." They didn't use the secret elevators or the back stairs. Kangdae walked through the front doors, the lobby's marble reflecting his grim silhouette. The guards, men who had once called him Sir, hesitated for a heartbeat, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his presence. That heartbeat was all he needed. Kangdae didn't fight with the calculated grace of a martial artist or the detached coldness of a mob boss. He fought like a man possessed. When the first wave of soldiers closed in, he didn't wait for a tactical opening. He threw himself into the center of the fray. He used his weight, his rage, and his scars. He took a shallow blade across the shoulder to shatter a man's windpipe. He absorbed a punch to the ribs to drive a knee into a traitor's sternum. He was messy, brutal, and terrifyingly human. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like an ascent into the mouth of a volcano. When the doors opened, the Viper was waiting, flanked by Jin Ho and a half-dozen gunmen. The chairman sat in the background, a silent god watching his creation crumble. "The eunuch returns," the Viper mocked, his gun leveled at Kangdae's head. "Tell me, did you come back to beg for a more comfortable grave?" Kangdae didn't answer with words. He lunged. The room erupted. Gunfire shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wind howling into the penthouse, scattering the marriage of lies contract papers like autumn leaves. Hee-sun moved like a shadow, taking out the perimeter guards while Kangdae focused on the men who had betrayed his spirit. He didn't care about the bullets grazing his skin or the shards of glass cutting his face. He pinned Jin Ho against a marble pillar, his hands closing around the man's throat. "You thought I was weak because I couldn't give the chairman a grandson?" Kangdae hissed, his voice a low, terrifying rasp as the light faded from Jin Ho's eyes. "My power never came from my bloodline. It came from the fact that I survived everything you people did to me." He dropped the lifeless body and turned toward the Viper. The rival leader was fast, but he was fighting for territory. Kangdae was fighting for the right to exist. They crashed through the remaining glass, tumbling onto the rain-slicked balcony 60 stories above the city. The Viper swung a heavy combat knife, the blade biting into Kangdae's forearm. Kangdae didn't flinch. He grabbed the Viper's wrist, ignoring the pain, and leaned in close, their faces inches apart in the storm. "You're a predator, Viper," Kangdae whispered, "but I'm the fire you tried to walk through." With a roar that came from the very marrow of his scarred bones, Kangdae used the Viper's own momentum to hurl him over the edge. There was no scream, only the sound of the wind. Kangdae stood on the precipice, blood dripping from his fingertips, his chest heaving. He turned back toward the room. The chairman was still there, his power evaporated, looking at his son-in-law with something that resembled fear for the first time. Hee-sun stood by the doorway, her weapon lowered, watching Kangdae. He wasn't the Iron King anymore, he was just a man. And as he walked toward Hee-sun, stepping over the wreckage of his fake life, he realized that for the first time, his hands weren't shaking. The armor was gone, but the man inside was finally whole. The penthouse was no longer a palace, it was a ruin. The wind shrieked through the shattered window frames, carrying the scent of salt and wet pavement, scattering the ashes of the marriage of lies into the void. The chairman sat in his high-backed chair, in the jade tiger talisman lying broken on the floor at his feet. He looked old, not the venerable age of a patriarch, but the hollowed-out age of a man whose currency had been exposed as counterfeit. Kangdae walked toward him, leaving a trail of dark, diluted blood on the white carpet. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over the man who had demanded a legacy built on performance. Behind him, Hee-sun moved silently, her presence no longer a decorative shield, but a living part of the new architecture of power. "The Viper is gone," Kangdae said, his voice level and devoid of the theatrical gravel he had once used to intimidate captains. "The men downstairs are waiting for a signal. They saw me walk in through the front door alone. And they saw you hide behind a man who sold your secrets for a seat in Gangnam." The chairman looked up, his lips trembling. "You have no heir, Kangdae. You have no future. The syndicate cannot follow a man who is incomplete." "The syndicate followed a lie because it was convenient," Kangdae replied, leaning down until he was eye to eye with the old man. "They followed a boss, who was nothing more than a suit filled with your expectations. That man died in the rain in Busan." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the medical files, the real ones, stained with water and grime, and tossed them onto the chairman's lap. "I am not an Iron King. I am a man who was burned, broken, and betrayed. And yet, I am the one standing here while your perfect world is in pieces." Hee-sun stepped forward, at her hand resting naturally on Kangdae's shoulder. It wasn't the practiced touch of a contract bride, it was the grounding weight of an equal. "The era of bloodlines is over, father," she said, her voice cold and crystalline. "We are not interested in producing a grandson for you to break. We are interested in building a syndicate that values loyalty over lineage. If the men want to follow a ghost, they can follow you into retirement. If they want to follow someone who can't be killed, they follow us." The chairman looked at them, really looked at them, and saw the terrifying synergy of two people who had nothing left to hide. The marriage of lies had been incinerated, and in its place was a partnership forged in the most honest fire imaginable. He saw that Kangdae's impotence had become his greatest strength. Because he could not rely on the traditional markers of manhood, he had been forced to develop a soul made of tempered steel. Without a word, the chairman stood and walked toward the elevator. He didn't look back. He knew that the Geumpa was no longer his. The crown had passed not through a birthright, but through a trial by fire. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Kangdae turned to the balcony. The storm was breaking, the first light of dawn bleeding through the clouds in bruised shades of purple and gold. He felt the phantom pain in his back, the scars from his father's cigarettes. But for the first time, they didn't feel like a weight. They felt like a map of the distance he had traveled. He looked at Hee-sun. She was bruised, her dress was a rag, and her eyes were tired, but she was the only thing in the world that was real. And he didn't need to perform for her. He didn't need to be the boss or the alpha. "What now?" she asked, looking out at the city that lay waiting beneath them. "Now," Kangdae said, reaching out to take her hand, not for the cameras, not for the chairman, but for himself. "We run this city like people who have already seen the bottom. We don't hide the cracks. We use them to let the light in." The new reign began not with a toast or a vow, but with a quiet, shared breath in the wreckage of a penthouse. The lies were gone. The king was human, and for the first time in his life, Kangdae felt truly powerful.